Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented in the 17th week of 2014 by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook, and it's April 22nd, Earth Day, the day each year on which events are celebrated worldwide to demonstrate support for environmental protection. It was first celebrated in 1970 and is now celebrated in more than 192 countries each year. Our program is about terrorism and what can be done to combat it. It's hard for us Americans to admit, but by far the greatest terrorist campaign in the world today is being run by the Obama administration, not by those we usually call terrorists. U.S. terrorism is not just Obama's drone strikes, which have killed almost 5,000 people, including 200 children. It's also the activities of the U.S. Special Operations Command, essentially the president's private army of more than 70,000, who are active, according to their own spokesman, in more than 130 countries around the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. It's part of the politics pursued by this and earlier administrations that have plagued the world with war and destruction. Not to protect U.S. citizens, it doesn't do that, but for the profits of the tiny American economic elite, the 1%, who have gotten 95% of the income gains in the Obama years. Most Americans don't realize that Obama is carrying out the most extreme global campaign of terror in living memory, in part because the media downplay it, and we accept the Obama administration's flat lies that their war is winding down. We'll talk about that tonight with commentaries from Ron Zoke, Weaponizing Flipper, Karen Aram, What Bangkok, Caracas, and Kiev Have in Common, Deb Johnson, End of the World as We Know It, and He Feels Fine, Stuart Levy, Israeli Apartheid Week and Spanish Justice, and comments from Karen Evans Levy. If there's time, with reference to the opening of Ebert Fest this week, I'll review a 50-year-old movie that's astonishingly relevant today. Our focus is on the war policy of the United States, what the United States government is doing and why, and it's being done in our name. We'll begin with Ron Zoke, Weaponizing Flipper.
Yes, I saw this story. It seemed to me unusually bizarre and interesting. The United States of America is now, it seems to me unquestionably, the most militaristic country in the world. And as an indication of what's happening, we have this little article from, Izvestia and The Wire in this country, saying the tense East-West standoff in the Ukraine could reach a new level of escalation underwater, according to reports from Russia and the USA. The United States Navy's Marine Mammal Unit will be deployed to the Black Sea this summer, where American dolphins and sea lions could find themselves nose to nose with their Russian counterparts. So apparently the Russians will have their own Marine Mammal Unit in the Black Sea operating from the Crimean Peninsula. The paper reports that according to a statement from the U.S. spokesman for the Navy, 20 dolphins and 10 sea lions will be in the Black Sea for 1 to 2 weeks this summer, conducting a NATO exercise in the body of water that's traditionally been dominated by the Russian Navy. The dolphins will be testing a new anti-radar system created to, quote, disorientate enemy sonars. And while the dolphins are doing that, the sea lions will be trained to look for mines and naval divers. According to this story, they also allegedly plan to test out new dolphin armor developed at the University of Hawaii. This will be NATO's first use of militarized sea creatures. The trip could also mark the first meeting of Russian and American sea creatures. Russia and the United States are the only countries known to have militarized dolphins at this time. Crimean dolphins which were owned by Ukraine before Russia recently acquired, well, says stole them, have trained in the Black Sea previously. Since Russia is revamping the Sevastopol Dolphin Training Center, it is extremely likely the Black Sea will be home to both sea creatures units at the same time this summer. And there's some further speculation about how difficult this will be and how hard it will be on the dolphins, who will be transported thousands of miles by air. The U.S. creatures will have to adjust to new waters. The Black Sea has a salinity of about 17%, whereas the Pacific Ocean, the regular home of the U.S. dolphins, has a salinity of 35%. Additionally, the water temperatures will be an adjustment. The Navy did not address whether the salinity or temperature would affect the sea lions and dolphins' abilities to perform exercises. So there's some speculation here about probable effects on the dolphins, but we're told not to worry, that the law protects marine mammals, and so no harm can come to them. But this made me wonder, when the armed Russian dolphins met the armed American dolphins, would they start fighting or would they start making love? I don't know.
No dolphins were injured in the subversion of this country.
Right. So going on to a more serious topic, from Reuters, massive operation in Yemen kills more than 30 al-Qaeda operatives in 2 days, by Danielle Wiener-Bronner. A weekend operation against members of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, is part of a massive and unprecedented campaign against the militant group. An unidentified Yemeni government official told CNN. According to the official, at least 30 AQAP operatives were killed in strikes on Saturday and Sunday, and now authorities are, quote, going after high-level AQAP targets. Reuters reported the death toll is closer to 40, saying that about 30 members were killed in 2 separate attacks on Sunday alone. 3 civilian casualties were reported on Saturday as well. So here we are killing large numbers of suspected militants. They added that those targeted were, quote, preparing to launch attacks against Yemeni and foreign interests in the area. Well, how so? How do they know that, what they were planning to do? It goes on to point out that some statements were made, apparently to this group, that action should be taken against America, but there's nothing here that would indicate that there was a capital crime.
And these, in fact, were drone strikes, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Guest commentary on April 18th in the local daily. Judicial ruling disastrous for Americans. This points out that 3 U.S. citizens, Anwar al-Awlaki, Alberto al-Awlaki, and Samir Khan, were executed in U.S. drone strikes in Yemen in 2011. This was justified on the basis that they were an imminent threat to the United States, although that was never spelled out. The most troubling aspects of this were that, Judge Rosemary Collyer threw out the lawsuit, even when she noted that the case raised serious constitutional issues, but I think she's subsequently been overruled by a unanimous panel of federal judges there. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of this case, according to this author, is that no government official will be held accountable for the murder of 16-year-old Ajabruman. A U.S. drone killed the younger al-Awlaki 2 weeks after a CIA drone killed his father and Samir Khan, who was the editor of a magazine sympathetic to al-Qaeda. So I think we have a serious problem here.
Yep.
But I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ron. Comments, ladies and gentlemen? The amazing court decision absolutely overruling the Fifth Amendment guarantee that says you cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The Obama administration reaches new depths of prevarication when they explain that due process of law means they've talked about it in the Justice Department.
Right.
I mean, you know, enough problems with the American constitutional guarantees here, but you can imagine the people who wrote them in the 18th century spinning in their graves over this ridiculous justification for essentially the ability of the American president to do as he's done, kill people at will. Now, if we read about this in the old Soviet Union or in one of the 20th century totalitarianisms, we say, well, yes, that's right. The courts are just subservient to power. Well, what do we say here?
Well, there's supposed to be a top secret 20 or 30 page legal memorandum justifying this.
Yeah.
Pointing out that it's illegal, single-spaced, but it's illegal for anyone to talk about it and to say what it says. So
since this
it's all top secret.
Since this decision, another court has said that the government has got to make that memo public.
Well, after it's been redacted, yes.
But the government is appealing the decision, and
Yeah.
it has to be made public at all. So,
Yeah.
thank you, Ron, or, you know, in a sense.
We might also bring up the question of freedom of speech. I mean, what at least Waki was nominally killed for was not leading violent attacks,
Right.
even
Right.
against the U.S. You know, even against combatants who are who would be legitimate targets of violence in principle during a war. If we had a war, which we don't, none of that. He's not accused of fomenting of doing violent acts, but of being an effective speaker
Exactly.
against
Right.
U.S. actions in Yemen and elsewhere.
And I think that was part of the reason why they killed his son, wasn't it? Because they believed that he would harbor the same opinions as
Yeah.
his father. So, I mean, that's like playing God. What
Well,
I don't understand.
Don't
that.
get picky, right?
Oh my goodness, to kill his son as well is just unbelievable.
You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll go to Karen Aram. What Bangkok, Caracas, and Kiev have in common.
Yeah. This is
It's us, isn't it, Karen?
Yes, yes. This is an article from Counterpunch last week by Andrei Vilcek, who is a credible investigative journalist, writer, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to read the first part of his article because his wit is quite good. They really should have a dedicated flight connecting some of the cities consumed by the protest orchestrated in Washington, London, and Paris. Let us please not pretend anymore that there are spontaneous outbursts against governments that have been elected democratically and supported by the majority of people in Eastern Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Let us be pragmatic and think of how to economize on the great spending of those billions of euros and dollars pushed down the throats of pro-Western NGOs in places like Thailand, Ukraine, South Africa, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia. He says 20 million lives of Soviet citizens, hundreds of millions of people murdered in what is now Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, and that is without even counting Africa. So let us have it all out in the open. Let us push for the introduction of this round-the-world long-distance flight in order to shuffle those agents of imperialism and neocolonialism, those Western apparatchiks and their lackeys, their media whores and their local butlers, sometimes called elites. He said such a service would save plenty of fuel by connecting all the hot spots in a very efficient way. Yes. He goes on to say he has worked just in this past year. He has been on the Turkish-Syrian border in Egypt, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Cuba, Ukraine, and Thailand. The similarities are stunning. The tents, electric generators, people imported from poor provinces, and even the slogans. Right now, it's this past week they were celebrating Songkran. That's the Thai New Year in Thailand, and he was able to observe a lot of the things that I have read about that took place to foment dissent and ended with killings in 1976. That is labeling people as communist. And he says there's a huge sign in this park. And he said he sees it. There's a huge sign proclaiming toxinism is communism tyranny. Now, Thaksin is the former prime minister who was then replaced by, through election, democratic election by his sister, Yingluck, and who many of these paid protesters representing the elite are fomenting dissent against. Okay. Thaksin Shinawatra, a communist, he said that that very business tycoon, a turbo-capitalist, whose only fault was that he introduced free medical care, which is much better than that of the United States. He improved education, he housed the poor, introduced microfinancing for the poor, and aimed at a much more egalitarian society than anything ever seen to date in Southeast Asia. Well, that dam, of course, unacceptable to the Thai elites, to the military, and their foreign handlers. Simply because in Thailand it is not just about money, but mainly about the gap that the rulers feel they need to maintain between them and the rest of the people. The rulers of Thailand need people to prostrate in front of them at their feet like elsewhere in those horrid Western colonies in Southeast Asia and in those feudal lands like the Philippines and Indonesia. Their people are conditioned to be slaves of the elites while children are raised and immediately broken, educated as slaves of their parents. He writes with great wit and sarcasm, but everything that he's saying is accurate. He said they all look the same. The desperados backed and financed by the so-called elites in Bangkok or Kiev, in Herrera and Caracas. Even the price for betraying one's country, the going rate, appears to be the same. That's approximately $10 per day. Yeah, they're even in uniforms, some of these so-called protesters against the democratically elected government. So I like the fact that he has come out and said pretty much what most of us have been thinking.
Thank you, Karen. Comments? I think one of the things that's worthwhile looking at here is the continuity of American policy, not just over time, over administrations, but also around the world, and the connection with the goals of American policy, which have particularly been to maintain an economic environment that is favorable to American investors, to the 1%. I mean, this is neoliberalism, which is understood as an economic policy that reduces social supports and puts instead workers at risk. This is to spread neoliberalism around the world. Now, of course, the U.S. has done that, and has done that consistently for a good long time, at least since it emerged as the only undamaged country from the Second World War. But the recent activities of the U.S. in places as widely removed as Bangkok, Caracas, and Kiev continues this same policy. The only thing that it seems to me to separate Bangkok from the other two capitals we're mentioning here is that the American energy politics are not quite so, at least as far as I understand it, involved in Thailand. The U.S., of course, managed to kill 4 million people in Southeast Asia and make sure that its economic writ ran there a generation ago. And Thailand was always a basis for what the U.S. was doing in Southeast Asia. Right. But the only thing that contrasts, perhaps, with Caracas and Kiev is that energy politics are not quite so central. Is that right? Or is
right. And now I can tell you, having worked in the energy field myself, I was told a couple, let's say about 5 years ago, certainly before Fukushima, that after China, the U.S. was looking at a nuclear project in Thailand. That was up. And I knew they'd been discussing one back in the early 90s, but it never came to fruition. I think that if we're talking about an infrastructure project that's of critical interest right now, I think it is the train. Giles Umpakorn, who is a scholar on Thailand, I did communicate with him about this, maybe a few weeks back, and he said, no, it's all just about politics. But then I noticed last week he did post something regarding the attributes of having a train, a high-speed rail train in Thailand, if only to end all of the deaths and accidents of people on the road. I also noted at the same time an American who I'm friends with that has worked for the U.S. government in various capacities over the years, mentioning the flaws of the train project that Laos is looking at, and how, you know, Laos really, they can't afford the debt, which of course is critical. I mean, what kind of loans are being made? But since both these nations have been looking at contracts with China, I suspect it won't involve the World Bank. And I know that the reason Thaksin gave the contract to China was because they could do it a lot less expensive than anyone else. So I still am focused, speculating only that the train project may be the reason why everything's coming to a head at this point, the need to overthrow what we would call real democracy. Remember back in the 60s, the US government wanted, they called Thailand their anchor,
Yes.
their anchor state. And they wanted the military dictatorship to introduce a veneer. And they actually call it the veneer of democracy. And this comes from Legacy of Ashes by Tim Weiner. And the U.S. put millions into setting this all up, but it failed. And the Thai generals, when they were called in to speak to the Americans, the embassy at the time, they simply said, "Oh, I'm sorry, democracy sounds really good, but it just won't work here." Well, eventually they did come about with a veneer of democracy. Unfortunately, Thaksin is the first leader, and I'm not saying he's this great guy. I mean, the Pheu Thai Party, or Thai People's Party, they turn a blind eye to the law of lèse majesté, which means you can be incarcerated for saying anything against royalty, or that's taken on the whole establishment. They have taken they've turned a blind eye. They're corrupt like many others, but they have done these things for the poor that no other government in Thailand has ever done. So I think it's dual. I think it's political, that the elite does not want somebody introducing health care to the poor. But they have already said they will reject the contract that they have with China. It will not go through if the Democratic Party there gets back into power, which is what their goal is.
Of course, the president's off to Asia today, you know, and
Yeah.
clearly the American policy is the isolation of China, which always strikes me as a bit bizarre, but that's the way they're thinking in Washington. Is it the end of the world as we know it, Deb, and how do you feel?
Well, today's the 40th anniversary of Earth Day, which is, you know, I was looking for some good news, and it was kind of hard to find.
Yeah.
I did find an article stating that the Eden Reforestation Project has planted 72 million trees. So that was probably the climax of the good stuff. The biggest threats that we still face are nuclear meltdowns, climate change, and environmental annihilation. And this just continues. But I saw that it was the 4th anniversary of the Gulf oil spill, BP oil spill, and BP stating that they're about finished with the active cleanup of Louisiana shoreline, which was quite shocking to the U.S. Coast Guard, who did not see it that way at all. They believe they might be in the middle phase in cleaning it up, and was pretty astounded that BP would make such a comment. But basically, I found this article. It's the end of the world as we know it, and he feels fine. Paul Kingsnorth, activist and author, attended an outdoor festival in southern England called Uncivilization, run by the Dark Mountain Project, a network of ecologically minded artists and writers, founded in 2009. And defining Dark Mountain's purpose, according to Mr. Kingsnorth, is to accept this age of ecocide. Like a long day's widower, we are finally becoming sensible to the magnitude of our loss, which is our duty to face. He arrived at this point 6 years prior after completing his second book, Real England, a travelogue about the homogenizing effects of global capitalism on English culture and character, which became a great success that warranted praise from major newspapers, Archbishop of Canterbury, politicians, etc. His ambivalence to such praise came from his interviews with shopkeepers and farmers fighting to maintain small traditional institutions, battling privatization and conglomeration. His recent notoriety left him in no mood to celebrate, and his previous 2 decades of environmental activism provoked a weariness, coupled next to the facts that the Arctic ice shrinkage levels haven't been seen in centuries, and NASA climatologist James Hansen's dire predictions of a mass extinction event. After decades of environmental activism, humanity continued to ignore the facts, and Kingsnorth, feeling helpless, drafted a manifesto called Uncivilization, a brooding document warning of an imminent fall of civilization. An initial print of 500 copies gained widespread attention, and the festival ensued. But others claimed it was reckless, even callous, and one critic dubbed the dark mountaineers to the complacent characters in Douglas Adams' novel, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. Diners enjoying watching the obliteration of life, the universe, and everything while enjoying a nice steak. Countering such charges is abandoning false hopes, such as engaging in movements like Bill McKibben's 350.org. It engages people with no chances of stopping climate change while selling a false premise. Taking these actions, we will achieve this goal, and when you can't, you're lying to people and they feel despair. Author and activist Naomi Klein knows Kingsnorth and agrees Dark Mountain has given people a forum in which to be honest about their sense of dread and loss. Quote, faced with ecological collapse, which is not a foregone result, but obviously a possible one, there has to be a space in which we can grieve, and then we can actually change. In 2012, Kingsnorth published a series of essays articulating his new dark ecological vision in the Nature magazine, Orion. Claiming his opposition view to neo-environmentalism, which is saving nature and people by embracing nuclear power, biotechnology, synthetic biology, and geoengineering. The notion that technology will stave off catastrophic effects of global warming is repellent, a distortion of the proper relationship between humans and the natural world, and evidence that in the throes of crisis, many environmentalists have abandoned the principle that, quote, nature has some intrinsic inherent value beyond the instrumental. Kingsnorth credits his way of thinking defending wilderness and natural beauty, first protesting against Margaret Thatcher's biggest road building program since the Romans in 1992. He wrote Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist, claiming his life's work would be saving nature from people. Later at Oxford, became editor of Cherwell, the university's longest-running student newspaper, staff including Rupert Murdoch. This honor translated into a research entry-level position at the Independent in London. He returned to Oxford and began to write his book, Real England. Kingsnorth collaboration with Dugard Hine, Dark Mountain's co-founder, published a series of literary journals. Naomi Klein being the best-known contributor, along with interviews with cultural ecologist David Abram and social critic Derek Jensen. These books, creating a surge of interest, has positioned Mr. Kingsnorth at the helm of an important movement. Not to mention a festival that pays homage to animal roadkill while at the same time allowing ourselves to feel the terminal illness. Kingsnorth lives in rural Ireland with his wife and children, and he recently moved to rural Ireland with his wife and children, and that's it.
Thank you, Deb.
You're welcome.
Comments?
I thought I had more.
Don't you think we should follow the advice given in Spamalot, which is playing now for 2 more weekends at Parkland Theater? Look on the bright side of death, the bright side of apocalypse, and the end of the world. Hey, cheer up.
Yeah, you're right.
There is a line here, I must admit, that I find disturbing is too strong, but people who quite obviously look at the very serious questions that environmental catastrophe poses for us, but then they answer they give is, well, let's go back to the Stone Age. This sort of anarcho-primitivism, and I say that as someone who in certain circumstances would certainly call myself an anarchist, but anarcho-primitivism that says, well, look, everything since the Neolithic Revolution has been a terrible mistake, let's go back. That seems to me not the way to deal with the problem. I mean,
Yeah.
the
Well, he
only
has his
solutions-
critics, for
Beg
sure.
pardon?
He has his critics, for sure. They
Yeah.
think he's just too dark. And but he finally got to the point where he saw that nothing positive was happening, and he sort of resigned himself to the fact that, the worst is inevitable.
I think
And
that's a counsel of despair.
Yeah,
The only
it definitely
solution
is.
we're going to find to the problems that climate change proposes are solutions that are essential, that are industrial.
Exactly.
They're technological.
Exactly.
We can't, we can't go home again.
There's a long tradition of this primitivist thought, going back at least to Rousseau, who thought that the arts and sciences really corrupted people. But I have really no sympathy with that, although they do make some interesting points.
I don't know about Kingsnorth, but I've read some of what Derek Jensen has written. And another environmentalist said of him that even when you disagree with him, he's very stimulating, and you may end up coming around to agree with him by other routes. So he's not suggesting that that going back to a non-industrial society would be a good thing. He just sees it as inevitable, and he doesn't
Right.
see that as, well, let me see. He talks about despair as something that's worth embracing, because in his terms, hope is an expression of desire for something over which you do not have agency. And given that he sees the industrial civilization and the violence that goes with it, the fall of that civilization as inevitable, what he counsels people to do is to sort of look for what they love in the world around them, and do whatever they can to protect it.
right.
Not to protect all of civilization, or even to say, a related comment of his is that it's not enough just to condemn the worst excesses of industrial civilization. You have to see it as a self-sustaining system, and that change will involve breaking out of the whole system, including the parts that aren't grossly harmful. You have to somehow envision a system that doesn't involve, that has people living and animals living and the living environment living, but that doesn't have industrial civilization in it. That's not an answer, but it's a very different thing from just calling for despair.
Right.
Well, I think in despair, things can stem from that. If people do become very sad about what is happening, then, and realizing the inevitable future, new things can stem from that. And I think that that's where he's at with it, because, it is when you're doing this for 20 years,
But
fighting and seeing that nothing is happening, that's despair. And
But if we fall to despair, then we're giving up, then there will be never any progress. And that's why I think we have to continue
Right,
to look at changing society. We need to change, the fact that poverty, war and violence, and degradation of the environment, they're all wrapped up into one. And we know that it's a whole new system, as Stuart was saying, that needs to be looked at. And if people, especially the younger people today, if they don't rise up and take control, there is no hope. But, one thing we never want to do is offer no hope to the young. So I think it's always important to continue being as positive and progressive as we can. And there are things that can be done, but they're not being focused on, certainly not by our government. And so it is up to the people. I support 350.org, the opposition to the Keystone Pipeline. I think that this has galvanized a huge segment of society. That's only one part of the problem, but at least it's brought awareness to a lot of people and galvanized them. And the more we unite on these issues, I think the more hopeful we will be.
Yeah, but it's difficult, I think, to maintain any decent morale in the face of our public life, which is so full of cynicism and crime and corruption that it's difficult to deal with. So the reaction of a lot of people is to go off to a commune somewhere and shut out the whole rest of the world.
Which is not sustainable either.
Nobody's done that
Right.
since 1972, has it?
Well, it keeps coming up again and again.
But I think you're right.
Friends of mine did it then.
So many people just feel that, well, there's nothing we can do about it. We're powerless about war, poverty, and
Well, we
and the
become
environment.
slaves to
and
the
so
system. I
they
mean,
just give up and they don't do anything. I mean, this has been the way it's been.
I think the other thing that this article does is bring up awareness. It's not just despair. If people are not aware of it, they can neither hope nor despair. And I think an article like this brings about awareness and the possibility of both, which brings up Israel Apartheid Week, which is also an awareness thing.
Okay.
Sure
I'd like
is.
to. I was actually going
Okay.
to go at this in a different order, but
Interesting.
yeah, I
I'm
wanted
sorry.
to bring up first a warning and then two directions of action. How about that?
Okay.
All right. So the warning is, as Carl mentioned earlier, Obama is visiting Asia this week and talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, trying to bring together a bunch of countries. It's called a trade treaty. There was actually an interview just yesterday on the NPR program Here and Now. No, I'm sorry, it was not on Here and Now. It was on Tell Me More.
We were. Oh my God.
Where the interviewer had a very cozy chat with a couple of business reporters. Did any of you hear this? Who were saying, well, this treaty is harmless. It doesn't really do much of anything, and we don't really know whether it's going to do good or bad. For us, it will probably be a mixed bag. But the main point that at least one of the two, Robin Farzad, I think, was saying was that, well, what we really need to do is to use this as a way of containing China. So, and this is a trade agreement that originally China had been invited to, and I don't think that invitation has ever been revoked. China may well could join it if they felt like it. It does involve a handful of other countries, some small, some pretty large, like South Korea and Japan. But the primary focus of the business position on this, and probably the administration position on it, is that it's good for our foreign policy. It keeps China at bay. It will reduce tariffs, and so it will be good for prices and good for exports. It's probably harmless, at least as harmless as the other trade treaties have been, and they've been a mixed bag. But what went essentially unmentioned are all the other effects. Well, both any criticism of the well, we need this for our foreign policy point of view, and any criticism of the other effects of this treaty, which is not even primarily focused on trade. It's focused on dismantling regulations and giving corporate rights primacy over over what would normally be democratic initiatives. So I think a very good write-up, and I hope there may be a rebuttal to this, comes from a public citizen, Lori Wallach at Public Citizen's Global Trade Watch has been writing about this. And she'd written about exactly this foreign policy argument being made. The proponents of the TPP are finding more and more objections to the TPP is going to be good for trade. People in Congress are getting restive about it, and so now they're bringing in we need this for, as she summarizes it, 3 basic claims, each of which has as little bearing in reality for the TPP as when they were used to sell past trade pacts. American power. If we approve this pact, the U.S. will maintain or gain economic and political influence in the negotiating countries. the region and the world. If we don't, other countries, name the boogeyman, will fill in the gap left by the U.S., bringing with them a model that undermines U.S. interests. If we approve this pact, we will strengthen our allies within the negotiating countries who share our free market and democratic values.
Our fake
and-
free market.
Yes, our fake free market. If we approve this pact, it would bring prosperity and stability to the negotiating countries. Failure to approve it would spell poverty and instability, provide a breeding ground for organized crime, narco-trafficking, and terrorism, threats to our national security. So she goes on to point out that this anti-China narrative, which is what it's become. Actually, one of the speakers yesterday had this wonderful line where it's saying, the U.S. is proving itself, is looking ineffective in Europe, and we need to go and look effective somewhere else. So we need he was really putting it in those terms. It's worth
This was
listening
on
to.
NPR.
I posted it on
Yeah.
Facebook.
Well, NPR, you know.
I know, exactly, that's the point.
Well,
NPR is as bad as the others.
oh, yeah.
ahead.
They
Sorry,
lost their
sorry.
funding.
Let's see. I'll quote a couple of other kinds of opposition to the TPP, to what's known of it so far, because it has been a secret agreement. Corporate negotiators, hundreds of them, have been in on it. The American public and even our legislators have not been, but some parts have been leaked. Who knows by whom? But it's a good thing because it provides levers for us to see what it would actually do to us if it passed. Paul Krugman in February wrote, "I'm in general a free trader, but I'll be undismayed and even a bit relieved if the TPP just fades away. What it would do is to increase the ability of certain corporations to assert control over intellectual property.
Yep.
Think drug patents and movie rights. Is this a good thing from a global point of view? Doubtful. The kind of property rights we're talking about can alternatively be described as legal monopolies. The corporations benefiting from enhanced control would often be American, but that doesn't mean that the TPP is in our national interest. What's good for Big Pharma is by no means always good for America." And Joseph Stiglitz had another more biting commentary, which I guess I'll skip. But anyway, be aware of what is being said about the TPP in the media these days, and look elsewhere. If nothing else, look at citizen.org at their Global Trade Watch to see for an antidote to what you'll probably be hearing in the media. So that's the warning. Now, two good things. There is a report that just a week ago, a Spanish judge, Paulo Ruiz or something like that, is proposing to defied pressure to scrap a probe that alleged torture in the U.S. prison camp in Guantanamo Bay. He's proposing to investigate Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld for their torture during the Bush administration. He also vowed to press on with two other investigations into alleged genocide in the former Spanish colony of Western Sahara from the 1970s. He's opened this investigation under universal jurisdiction. Human rights atrocities may be tried in any country under that principle. The Spanish Parliament just last month passed a government reform to restrict courts' ability to do that. But he's saying you can't do this. So there may be an argument between the Spanish courts, including this guy, whom we should cheer on, and the Spanish legislature, who may try to tell him to get lost. So the suggestion, and this is coming from David Swanson and from a number of other groups, the suggestion is to sign on to a letter addressed to the Spanish government and the people of Spain, saying that, thanking them for doing what our legal system cannot do, and urging them to proceed to allow this court to proceed against Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld and to investigate torture. So that's one thing. There will be, I think in a day or so probably, a letter that we can sign on to, sponsored by Roots Action. So that should go around. So that's one thing. Another thing that's being done by the wonderful local group Students for Justice in Palestine is all this week, every day on the University of Illinois Quad and in various rooms, they're holding Israeli Apartheid Week. So they have a wall. I think you'll be seeing some pictures of that wall. It's not as impressive as the one they managed to put up a couple of years ago. The university put restrictions on them, but it's still quite an impressive site. And they're also, today, it will be gone by the time you hear this, they've put up a house complete with a welcome mat and decoration flowers and so forth. And this house is to be demolished. Yes, as an example of what happens routinely to Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza. They have a number of events. I'll list the ones that will still be happening by the time you hear this. So on Wednesday evening, April 23rd, at 7 in the Ceramics Building, room 218, there's a panel discussion from a couple of local professors on the current political situation in Palestine and the role that the U.S. is playing in it. The professors are Ken Kuno from, I think, CSAMES, and Hadi Esfahani, who's, I think, a sociologist. So that's Wednesday night at 7, Ceramics 218. Then on Thursday, also at 7, and in the YMCA, there's a talk from Dr. Issam Nassar, The Palestinian People, Culture in the Midst of Oppression. Culture and traditions of the Palestinian people are being threatened. Historian and Illinois State University professor Dr. Nassar will look at the origins of this cultural change and its conclusions relating to the present situation in Palestine. They're also going to be having, I think, midday each day on the quad for the rest of the week. They'll be passing out mock eviction notices, such as Palestinians might get when their houses were about to be bulldozed. So anyway, they're putting on a good show, and they really want to encourage people to come and not just to appreciate the show, but to come and talk about the issues. So.
Which brings up what I want to talk about. So in response to the University of Illinois Students for Justice in Palestine Week talking about the Israeli apartheid situation, a new registered student organization started up this week in direct response. And the response group is called the Illinois Students Supporting Israel, the ISSI. Noah Feingold, who started the group, also sent out this message. I will just read 2 paragraphs from the message. During the main part of this week, there will be a large wall on the quad that wrongfully accuses Israel of committing humanitarian crimes. Basically, some students will try to demonize the state of Israel and make students on campus uncertain about the relation to it. ISSI, the Illinois Students Supporting Israel, along with myself, Noah Feingold, strongly object to the harsh and misleading rhetoric. We think that promoting hate against one side is counterproductive to the peace talks that are currently taking place between Israel and the Palestinians under the leadership of Secretary of State John Kerry. And then he goes on to say that our goal is to promote a positive message at Illinois that supports the peace process and the two-state solution. I urge you, Noah again, I urge you to exercise restraint by not engaging in any confrontations with the people organizing the Apartheid Week and the wall. And that's the end of the quote. My comments are, I agree that a wall is a powerful statement. If a small temporary wall on the university campus is, quote, accusing Israel of committing humanitarian crimes, unquote, then what does Israel's huge wall do? Israel's wall is huge. It is within the West Bank, with some of the Palestinian territory actually intentionally on Israel's side, is about 700 kilometers long, that's 430 miles, is 26 feet tall in many places, and made out of concrete. It's permanent. Permanent walls say a whole lot more. A small temporary wall is a good way to demonstrate what the United States foreign policies allow Israel to build.
That's great.
Questions and comments?
I just want to make one comment related to China and the TPP, or TTP, whatever. They did actually, I remember making this statement a few months ago. China did make overtures that they did wish to be involved, but they were immediately rebuked. So
Yeah, they're sort of like Russia's
Right.
overtures to join NATO.
yeah,
Right, exactly,
right.
yeah.
So I mean, giving a substantial evidence that clearly this is about isolating China.
It is
Although
our
earlier than
stated
that, they had-
intention to isolate Russia and now to isolate China as well.
Yeah.
Can we turn both of them into pariah states and
exactly.
isolate them from the rest of the world, I think it's becoming clear who's going to actually be isolated.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly,
yeah.
Ron.
There's a famous headline in the London Times, the Times of London in the 19th century. The headline was, "Storm in Channel, Continent Cut Off." It seems to me that, the present American policy is looking a lot like that. So
But this may be a matter of evolution, too. Lori Wallach points out that in, I think, November of 2012, China was actually invited by Hillary Clinton to join the TPP. So this may be the evolution of this thing from, a pro-corporate trade pact to an instrument of foreign policy
Yeah.
over that time.
And we should note that the Obama administration has a parallel arrangement under discussion with Europe. Now, in fact, Europe and the U.S. have essentially free trade agreements. Free trade, of course, here is a euphemism, and the problem is the language, as I think you pointed out, Stuart, has been colonized. What free trade means is corporate rights.
Yes.
The TPP is primarily a way of allowing corporations to escape regulation by the countries within the TPP agreement and carry on their business in their exploitative fashion without the threat of popular legal constraints on what they're doing. Now, we've got essentially that arrangement with Europe right now, and the Obama administration is pressing for a European agreement that would produce would generalize the effect there parallel to the TPP. So it's, this is bound up with American policy, not just of this administration, but particularly of this administration, because they're there now, and is also bound up with Obama's global assassination program and the war policy. They're all of a piece. The same people are running them in Washington, and they're after the same goals, essentially world economic control for the benefit of the tiny economic elite in America. And until we understand that, the sort of popular outrage that should greet these things will be hard to get underway. We saw what happened with NAFTA. NAFTA was the North American Free Trade Agreement in the Clinton administration, in which exactly this was done for the Western Hemisphere, and the result was, as the Clinton administration realized right away, a destruction of Mexican agriculture that produced a vast refugee crisis. And so the Clinton administration, as they arranged for NAFTA, also militarized the southern border of the United States because they knew all those desperate people whose agricultural base was destroyed for the benefit of American corporations and their subsidized agricultural products would be coming north. And, the old SDS maxim, everything is connected, is worthwhile thinking about here.
Yeah, the great majority of land in Mexico was given to subsistence farming, people who grew a little corn and beans for their own use, and eventually cheaper American corn made that impossible for them to have any kind of cash crop at all. And so many of them started coming north from Mexico and Guatemala, and that was the actual effect.
And I'm just going to point out that destroying Mexicans' agricultural wasn't just corn and beans, it was all the tropical fruits that are also, that can't be grown in the United States that,
Hey, it's free trade.
Right.
We destroy it all. Crucial point about what's going on at the little university down the street by Students Justice for Palestine, and glad to see that's mentioned. I think it's worthwhile to remember that not just for our program, but for what Americans should be doing in regard to Israel. The organization, the student organization that Karen talked about is an example of the discussion that should be taking place when we realize that our complaints about the crimes of the State of Israel are not finally directed at Israel, not finally directed at Tel Aviv. They're directed at Washington. If without the support of the United States, diplomatic, financial, military, economic in general, Israel would not be able to continue the oppression of the Palestinians. I mean, it would simply, the weight of the world's disapproval, which is very great, would be too much for it. But Israel knows that it has the support in all these crucial areas of the United States. And so when we look at things that are the crimes that are committed by Israel, such as the results of the apartheid wall that Karen was talking about, we should call Washington.
Well, the comment about Kerry fostering peace,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, that was pretty funny.
Yes,
okay?
it's pretty funny.
Because I really don't think they want peace. I know peace is the last thing on Israel's mind as far as the Palestinians go. And
I'm not
I
entirely sure
don't
that's
agree.
true. They want peace, but everybody wants peace. Hitler
On their
wants
own
peace.
terms.
They want peace on their terms.
Right,
And their
right.
terms is the Palestinians reduced essentially to Bantustans, as in apartheid South Africa. Little homelands, little spots of homeland within the area for the Palestinians. I must say that Israel's policy is not so liberal as the South African apartheid policy was, because South Africa knew that if it was going to try to confine the black population to these Bantustans, they had to pay for them. They had at least to support them economically. Israel has no interest in supporting economically the Palestinian Bantustans.
Right.
They
They'd rather
simply
just get rid of all of them, or that
Yeah.
they would
Yeah.
disappear. Or
One note I would like to make on that. Vice is a 30-minute short on HBO, and a couple weeks ago they were pointing out that AIPAC, which is the organization which supports the Israeli lobby, or it is part of the Israeli lobby.
Here in the United
It
States.
is the Israeli lobby here in the U.S.
Our big
That the
one.
majority of the supporters are actually evangelicals. And most of the money that is donated to AIPAC for all of this are evangelicals. So I just throw that out there.
True enough. Another point on the Student of Justice for Palestine demonstration that Stuart described, it was a demonstration very similar to this that led to the banning of the SJP organization, Students for Justice for Palestine, at Northeastern University in Boston. This is shocking, quite frankly. I mean, I thought these things were decided in 1964 in Berkeley. You know?
Right.
The Northeastern administration has done just terrible things here, and it's gotten remarkably little publicity. They've banned a student organization for things that they said. And and they've got away with it. The administration seems to have got away with it, at least for the time being. Similar attempts are going on elsewhere, and it seems to me that anyone who's been kicking around universities for the last generation or so should be appalled at this rolling back of the American of the free speech guarantees that we took for granted in the university. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 17th week of 2014. It's what White House aides call Terror Tuesday, the day each week when President Obama picks out some people to be murdered by drones or U.S. death squads. The president's underlings, notably CIA Director John Brennan, who's been off in Kiev on other business recently, compile a list of who should be executed, such as the people in Yemen that Ron was talking about. And the president then chooses from the baseball cards presented to him who will die. The assassinations are carried out in secrecy. The administration doesn't release accounts of the people they kill, but literally thousands of men, women, and children have been killed on Obama's order, and it continues. Most Americans don't know that the U.S. is running this terrorist program, don't know that he is responsible for the deaths of literally thousands of people by drone strikes in his administration. There's been more in his administration than any other, of course. Our thanks to Yasin and Yosef for direction and production, thanks to whom also this program will be available on YouTube. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. This is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aaron, Ron Zoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, Deb Johnson, other members and friends of Aware, saying the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.